Hello, my quilting friends. My name is Leah Day, and welcome to episode 118 of the podcast. And today I am going to be chatting about the pros and cons of pre-cuts. Pre-cut fabrics are really cool. These came out, I want to say it was around 12 years ago. I seem to remember it was around the 2008-2009 time period because this was right when I was really getting into quilting and making a lot of quilts. And all of a sudden, these pre-cuts started showing up in stores, and they were just such a fun impulse buy, and they were really easy to use. And so this has evolved now for more than 10 years. We have so many pre-cuts available to us now. 5-inch squares, sometimes they're called charm packs, could be called stamps. I've seen lots of different names for those. Pre-cut 2.5-inch strips. Those can be jelly rolls. They can be, this is a roll up. The different brands have different names, and of course they've kind of copyrighted those names or whatever in order to make them their own. But yeah, these jelly rolls are super cute. Those are definitely an impulse buy, and as you can see, they're cute and they are also so nicely contained and decorative that it's very tempting to want to leave them in their package and not open them up and actually use them. It's debatable. One thing we have pre-cuts that are actually cut fabric, and then we have fat quarters. And to some quilters, fat quarters do not count as a pre-cut because that's basically it's basically a half of a yard of fabric that's been cut in half widthwise versus a skinny little quarter of a yard that's just cut off the end of a bolt. You know, if you go with just a quarter yard of fabric, you'll get something that's about 9 inches by 45, something like that. So it'll be a long, skinny 9-inch wide strip. If you go with a fat quarter, you'll end up with something that's around 18 by 21. So it's a much more usable piece when it comes for quilting. So some people consider fat quarters a little bit of a cheat when it comes to a pre-cut because you can really cut a lot more things out of a fat quarter than you could, let's say, a 5-inch pre-cut square or a 10-inch pre-cut square. And I'd say those are like the most common ones that I see. 2.5-inch strips, 1.5-inch strips, and that is 1.5 inches by the full length of the fabric, so that's like anywhere from 40 to 45 inches long. 5-inch squares, 10-inch squares, and those are the common ones. And then you can get some really, really weird ones too. I mean, I've got some pre-cut hexagons that were, I think, laser cut. They were not cut out obviously with a ruler. I think they were laser cut. So you can get some weird stuff, but I think the companies have figured out that these are really successful things to sell, and so they're constantly coming up with new ideas and new fabrics and new shapes and sizes. But those are really the ones that I think are the most popular. 2.5-inch strips are what we use a lot in quilting. We use that typically for sashing. You can use that as borders. 1.5-inch is a little bit less common, but that finishes out at a 1-inch strip, so that looks really cute in most blocks. And then 5-inch is, you could take one pack of 5-inch squares, sew those together, and have a baby quilt. You only need one pack of it. So yeah, the pre-cuts are super popular. And it hasn't taken long for them to take off, basically. And so in this episode, I want to talk about what are the good sides of working with pre-cuts, what are the benefits, and then also what are the cons, because there are some cons in this, guys. There are some definite drawbacks to working with pre-cuts, especially if you get into quilting and you get kind of addicted to pre-cuts and you don't, go out of the pre-cut arena, because there's some things that you might be missing as far as skill goes, that you're not building skill for cutting and working with yardage. And so let's start with that. Yardage, this is just a piece of, this is actually a piece of canvas. I think I bought this for a costume, but this gives you an indication of what yardage is. So it is fabric cut off of a bolt of fabric. It is a big, giant piece of fabric, and it can be overwhelming to get hit with something like this. Like, what in the world do you do with it? I've got lots of tutorials, many, many tutorials on how to starch, press, and process your fabric, how to square it so that way you can cut nice, accurate strips, but it is time consuming. So the number one pro of working with pre-cuts is it's already cut for you, so it's faster. So you don't have to take, let's say if there's like 20 different colors of fabric in this, 1.5 inch skinny strip pack, and I think there is probably 40 odd colors, you don't have to take 40 different fabrics, wash them, starch them, press them, and cut strips out of them. So it is definitely saving you a lot of time from that. Yardage is time consuming largely because it is such a big piece of fabric. It is a lot of space to work with, and it can be overwhelming, at least in the beginning, to get hit with something like this. So definitely watch my other tutorials on how to work with yardage, on how to deal with that, and cutting it down into smaller pieces is absolutely allowed. A lot of times people will ask me about that, and I don't ever try and starch and press and work with like 2 yards of fabric at once. I will always rip that down and make it smaller. And yes, I do think ripping is far better when you're taking a big piece of fabric and cutting it down into usable pieces. I think ripping is far better than cutting, because ripping will rip with the grain line of the fabric. Now, if you were talking about cutting strips, like let's say you want them all to be 2.5 inches wide, then you're going to want to cut that. You wouldn't want to rip that, because when you rip, it leaves a really jagged edge. Let me see if I can rip this I mean, this is not quilting cotton. This is just what I happen to have out here in the crafty cottage. So I'm not even sure if I can truly rip this and give you guys an idea of what I'm talking about here. But I'm planning on making a nice little shop apron out of this. Okay, yeah, it does rip pretty easily. But you can see where it rips, you're going to lose about 1/4 of an inch of fabric on that ripped edge, because the edge frays and it distorts, okay? Ripping, I still feel like, even with the distortion like that, it's still preferable to cutting big pieces of yardage. If I could buy 4 yards of something, and I often will go and buy 4 yards of something, okay? Before I wash it, I will rip it into 1 yard lengths. And I do that so that way it's more manageable. It goes into my washing machine, and it might tie itself up in a knot, but it's not going to twist and twist and twist and become this huge long snake that then doesn't get washed properly and then doesn't dry properly. So that's the reason why I break that down. The only time that I don't break a piece of yardage, like I leave it big, is if it's backing fabric. And that's the only time. And it drives me crazy, but backing fabric needs to be big because it's the back of a quilt. So I hope that makes sense. That is just initially why pre-cuts have an advantage. They are faster to work with. You don't have to worry about this big piece of fabric, and you don't have to worry about washing it either. So that is another thing. Pre-cuts can't be washed. If I went and took this and unwrapped it and stuck it in my washing machine, what would come out would be a very large ball of frayed threads. I wouldn't end up with any fabric left over. It would fall apart, right? So you can't pre-wash any kind of pre-cut. So this is actually going to be a pro and a con, and I'm going to talk about why that's a con a little bit later on, but it is faster. You're going to basically unroll it, unwrap it, and be able to jump in and get started immediately. Another advantage of a pre-cut is the fact that you get so many pretty colors, and you don't have to buy, you don't have to go to the store and pick up 20 bolts of fabric, individual bolts of fabric, go and say, oh, I want a little sliver. I want just that little bit, or I want just a 1/4 yard, You can get all of those different colors in one pre-cut pack, and it's not super expensive. I think maybe I can't remember off the top of my head how much each one goes for. I think jelly rolls are something usually around $35 to $40. I want to say that charm packs are somewhere around $7 to $10. I mean, I'm rolling off of my memory of what I spend on these things, guys. I have stopped buying pre-cuts, and I'll get into that as to why. But the prices are comparable to what you would spend in yardage. So it's not like you're paying an enormous amount more. you might not be able to get as far with pre-cuts, and there's some reasons for that. Number one, you have a jagged edge. They do pinking on the edge. It's like a pinking shear kind of effect. If you really want accurate quilts, you will cut that off, but then that adds more time back into the process. So you kind of have to go, all right, which is more important, speed or precision? Which do you want more? I lean towards precision. So me personally, if I'm going to be working with something like this, I will either pick a unit such as like half square triangles, quarter square triangles, hourglass squares, something like that. And I will make my pre-cut into that unit that's going to need to get trimmed down and squared up anyway at the end. Or if not, then I will trim these up. Like I'd take a 5-inch square and trim it down to a 4.5-inch square. Right? And that's just going to ensure that it's more accurate. But yeah, I can absolutely say there's a couple quilt shops in my area that I just don't buy fabric there, because I know if I even pick up 1 or 2 bolts, it's going to be a 30-minute wait while they clean all their junk off of the cutting table. It drives me crazy. That's kind of a little rant for another day. But basically, they are always cutting, I think, kits or something for their shop. And so they always have all this junk all over the cutting table. And then when a customer comes in and has bolts that they want cut, then they have to clean up all their junk off the cutting table. And it's always a 30-minute wait. So if I got up there with 20 different bolts of fabric in order to simulate something similar to a pre-cut, I'd be there all day, right? So that's, like I said, that's a little bit of rant. Sorry about that, guys. But, it is faster and it is convenient. You don't have to go and shop and pick up all those bolts, and they're really heavy and all that kind of stuff. And then they might not even have as good of a selection. Like this is a batik one. This one's kind of more a solid kind of a graphic prints. They might not even have a huge selection of all of that design in the store. And so you might just be looking around going, well, I can get more fabrics, more choice in this pack than I can get in the whole store and what they have available. So you never know what you're going to get. But I'd say that's definitely a pro, is, all of those pretty fabrics all in one bundle, all ready for you. And that's what honestly makes it such an impulse buy, because it's all pretty and all ready to go. I mean, I will be honest, I have some fat quarter packs. Definitely fat quarter packs, a big, tall, long one that I use as decoration. I have never unwrapped it. I have no desire to unwrap it because I use it as a decoration in my cabinet with some dishes. So that's another thing, is that you don't necessarily have to feel pressure to unwrap it and make anything out of it. You can use it as decor for different seasons in your house, and that is absolutely allowed. You can use your fabric for whatever you want to, right? Okay, so what is another pro? It's far less effort to shop for multiple fabrics. It's far less effort to get that cut. You can make a quilt in a day, and I have more than proven this. So I was getting quilty blocks. I still get quilty blocks every month, and I was taking the pre-cuts that come in quilty box, and I was basically setting down and designing a quilt that you could make in a matter of hours. Now, it would take Dad and I working together, and then also I was writing a pattern too. So it was a little bit more effort than one day, but we would manage to get most of a quilt planned and knocked out in a matter of 2 to 3 days. So you can take let's say this 5-inch pack, okay? If you spread these out and came up with some sort of arrangement and started sewing them together, you could have a baby quilt top ready to get started quilting in one afternoon, in a matter of hours. So it's absolutely possible to go from no quilt at all to something started and some substantial progress in one day, versus yardage. I get yardage home and, fabric off the bolt. I get home, first it's got to be washed. Then it's got to be starched. Then it's got to be pressed. And this can be a process if it's a lot of fabric coming in the house all at once. And, usually it's 2 or 3 days before I can get around to having all the pieces ready to go. Everything's cut out, everything's ready to go, and the piecing can begin. So that's another benefit, is that you can go buy something today. You can pick up that pre-cut and get started, and you will have your quilt done. If not by the end of the day, well, then the next day or so. Okay? And another really cool benefit, and I actually can help you guys with this one a little bit, and that is pre-cut specific patterns. So this is one thing that I think is really excellent about pre-cuts, and that is you can pick this up and you can search, like, this is a Kona skinny strip set, and you could go and run a search on that, and I bet you could probably find 10 to 20 patterns specifically written for this size, for a 1.5 inch strip pack. And, it's just a matter of searching and finding the right search terms in order to find the pattern that you like to make. But there are lots and lots of pre-cut specific quilt patterns. I know Missouri Star Quilt Company has knocked that out of the ballpark. Jenny Doan has become famous. She's world famous now for focusing specifically on pre-cut quilt patterns and, piecing something and making a block and then turning that into a quilt, showing different variations and stuff of that. And she's done a great job with that. I did the Quilty Box, and you can find all of my free quilt patterns at leahday.com/free patterns. So that's where you can find all of those. And all of those, whether it's fat quarters or I know I did a lot of jelly rolls, a lot of 5-inch squares. There's just a wide variety of different sizes and shapes. And whatever you're looking for, you can find a pattern to work with that. And if not, this is the last pro that I really feel like is important to emphasize, and that is empowering you to design your own pattern. It's perfectly fine. In fact, actually, I think it's a great step for a quilter to go, I can make a quilt out of that. I don't need some pattern, to take those, squares and mix them with some other squares and make a whole mess of half square triangles and then lay those out and come up with pinwheels or your own star block or whatever you like. And then just play with that arrangement until you get something that you like and you've designed it and then you put it together. And I love that, because I think once you really start doing the design aspect yourself, it's really going to open up a whole new world of quilting for you, and you're going to start creating quilts that mean more. And as you guys know, that is always my goal, is to help you guys make quilts that mean more, that are extremely meaningful to you. And I feel like that comes from being challenged in the process of not just following the rules or following the steps of a pattern, of looking at that jelly roll or that, skinny strip pack and going, I want to make that into a quilt that looks like a maze, or a labyrinth or something like that, and designing it on graph paper and then making that. It's a challenge. It's not, it's not as easy as just following the steps in a pattern, but it's so rewarding when you end up with something that's completely unique to you, right? So yeah, I'm not knocking pre-cuts. I love pre-cuts. I think they're really awesome, and I use them a lot, or at least I used to. And so now I'm going to go into the cons, and I'm going to explain some of the reasons why I'm moving away from pre-cuts, why it's no longer the thing that I really want to play with, and some warnings. If you get into this and you get kind of addicted to pre-cuts, what are some things that you're going to be missing out on skill-wise? And then that might turn around and bite you if you want to get into a higher level of quilting, such as showing, such as, really complex piecing, that kind of thing. What are some things to watch out for? Okay, so what are the cons? Let's go back to the very beginning and talk about preparing yardage. So this is the first one, and that is, I can't wash this. That is both a pro and a con. It's a pro in that it's faster. I can just jump right in, right? Now, I wouldn't jump right in. I would take the time to starch and press any pre-cut that I use. And the reason is fabric, whether you buy it off the bolt or you buy it from a pre-cut, it is naturally loosey-goosey, wobbly-bobbly, right? It's going to be doing its own thing. It's going to be dancing its own dance. It's going to be wiggling and wobbling and stretching and skewing all over the place. And if you stick a ruler on top of that and you try and cut it accurately, so let's say I wanted to piece this together and create rail fence blocks. Rail fences are just basically 3 or, as many strips as you want, strips, and then they're cut into a square. So you piece the strips together and then you cut it into a square. So if I wanted to piece that, and these are going all over the place, So I piece them together, and some of them are stretching and some of them aren't. So they're kind of going all together and they're rippling and doing kind of some weird stuff. And then I lay my ruler down and cut that. I'm not going to cut an accurate square. It's not going to come out right. All the edges are going to be wavy. And then when I try and piece that, wobbly bobbly thing to something else, it's not going to piece well. My edges, my seams are not going to go together easily. It's going to be a fight to get things to match accurately. I'm not going to just be able to use fingertip pressure to keep those seams together. I'm going to have to pin every single thing and then stretch and skew and fit and force fit it together, right? So no, I don't just open up the pack and go straight into it. I will always unroll the fabrics and I will always starch and press them. And I have another whole podcast episode about starch. If you are wondering about it, I know that starch has a bad reputation in the quilting community. I have heard that more than once, guys. And it was funny. I came out to the Crafty Cottage today and I kind of was like, there's some proof that bugs aren't actually attracted to starch. I had some starch in here and the bottle kind of did something weird and some starch had spilled out. I don't know what had happened. Maybe it had gotten too hot, I think, and some starch had spilled out. Well, I have bugs out here in the Crafty Cottage. This is kind of partially in the woods. So if there's anything even slightly edible in here, like I once dropped a peanut on the floor and I had an ant problem for 6 months. So if there's anything edible even slightly, trust me, all the bugs in the woods know about it and they suddenly invade. So nothing was licking up that starch that I spilled. Nothing was interested in it. And that's really the thing that quilters it's a myth that is spread around a lot because I'm sorry, it has never been proven satisfactorily to me that a starch causes bugs to be more attracted to fabric. Cotton fabric is cotton. Cotton is a natural fiber. Wool is a natural batting. These things bugs eat naturally whether you put starch on it or not. And whenever you wash the finished quilt, whether you use starch or not, the starch is going to wash out at the end anyway. So the way I look at it is it absolutely does amazing things for helping the fabric be more stiff and stable and easy to cut accurately, which then makes your piecing more accurate because then it's stiff and stable and it's not wobbling all over the place. And so all of that is benefit that I feel like far outweighs any potential myth that bugs are going to be more attracted to it. And like I said, that little puddle of starch on my table that I noticed, if it was yummy to bugs, trust me, they would be in here eating it, and they aren't. So I think that pretty much proves it to me, at least. Probably not to you guys, but that's okay. I have only heard that 1,000,001 times, and that's why I did that podcast episode, because it's a great quilting debate. I mean, it is really one of those things that we like to debate and argue about, and some quilters do it one way, and some quilters do it another. And this is just one of those things, guys. We argue about it, and there's not a right or wrong. There's not one single definitive way of doing anything in quilting, and I want you to know that. It's really easy to get stuck on, the right way of doing something, and there isn't a right way. There's just not. There's a million different options, and you've just got to decide what works best for you. What works within your time frame and your craft and where you're wanting to go with it and what you're wanting to do with it. So that leads to the next thing that I feel like is a con. You can't wash this, which means that this dark blue 2.5-inch strip pack could turn your whole quilt dark blue or baby blue. Fabrics bleed. This is something that I think a lot of people that don't wash their quilts find out the hard way. Like they gift a quilt to somebody and then they wash it and then it bleeds, and I think a lot of quilters are in the habit of just not washing their quilts, which I think is kind of, sorry, judgy, yes, but gross. I do think that's kind of gross. I wash my quilts. I drag them around the floor. I curl up on the couch, and my cats are on the couch too. So of course I wash my quilts, and I want to make sure that my whites stay super white, that my darks stay super dark, and that they don't merge together and create some kind of weird quasi color that's gross. I mean, trust me, when blue bleeds, it doesn't bleed bright blue. It bleeds kind of a gray, icky blue, and it doesn't look good on the white, and it's not consistent. It's not like all the white's going to change to another color. It's all going to go dingy, and then some areas are going to be more blue than others. So it's not even a good look if it does bleed. So you got to watch out for that, and that's a downside of a pre-cut. This is the reason why I feel like batik pre-cuts, I love batiks, guys. You know that. You know I'm a huge, huge fan of batiks. But I feel like batik pre-cuts can be dangerous. I would be really careful about using something like this with white fabric. I don't know that that is going to be a good idea. I think that those fabrics have a tendency to bleed. There is usually, if there's going to be excess dye in any kind of fabric, it's going to be hand dyes and batiks. You better bet that those are going to bleed some, if not a lot. And I have gotten a hold of some that took 6, 7 washings with dye grabbers, with Synthropol, to get them to stop just leaking. And that can be the manufacturing process, where if they did not dye with the right chemicals at the right temperature, then the dye is not going to hold into the fabric. It's just going to continually leak out. And identifying those fabrics that have problems, that's something that you can do in the pre-washing process. That's something you can do when you're working with yardage that you can't do when you're working with pre-cuts. So this is just a general piece of advice. I would say if you're going to work with pre-cuts and you really like them, I would stick with solids or prints. You know, a lot of our higher quality prints don't bleed nearly as much. You know, it's negligible. So, I mean, if you're mostly piecing with these types of fabrics already, you're probably not noticing any sort of bleeding going on. But if you want to then switch to something like hand-dyed fabrics or batiks, you're going to notice a major change. And this is the thing that I think is a limitation, is, you know, saying that only work with solids or only work with prints. Well, that's limiting you and your choices. And you might very well want to be working with solid reading batiks or with hand-dyed fabrics that you've made yourself, right? And that's a door that you would be shutting by saying that you only want to work with that. So it's something to watch out for. And I do think in general, pre-washing fabric, while it takes more time, yes, it does help in the quilt making process. It gets that shrinkage. It's not a lot of shrinkage. I get a lot of questions from people about like combining a pre-cut that has not been pre-washed with yardage that has been pre-washed. There's never really enough shrinkage in the fabric to cause that to make that a problem. If I am piecing, and typically with a pre-cut, you're going to need a yard or two of fabric to go with it. So let's say I wanted to use these 2.5-inch strips. Well, then I would need other fabric to go with it. Well, let's say I might mix these two together. So I would use 2 different pre-cuts together in one quilt. Well, then which one's the background color? Am I going to need something else? Well, let's say I'll just grab this one too, and put all of those together. I might be able to come up with something with all of that together in one go. It's going to be rather busy. I typically instead would go and grab 1 or 2 yards of a solid background fabric, white, black, blue, green, something like that. And then that would become my background color. And I would use a significant amount of that to go around the pre-cut pack, especially if it's busy fabrics in the pre-cuts, then I want something solid in my background fabric. So that way it's not just ridiculously busy all over the place, right? So that's something to think about too. I don't think it's a problem to pre-wash that yardage, starch press it, get it ready to go, and then just starch and press your pre-cut. I've never had a problem with that. But I do think in general, let's say where you want to go with quilting. You've been thinking about where you want to go with quilting. You've been thinking about what you want to do next, and you really want to win a ribbon at a quilt show. And if that is a goal on your list and you'd like to make that happen, I don't think pre-cuts are going to fit with that. That's not me being judgy. I just don't feel like that's probably going to be the best fit, because you're going to want to have intense control over those fabrics and what they're doing. You're going to want to be able to know how they're going to react and know how wiggly wobbly they're going to be. You're going to want to know if they're going to bleed or distort or have any sort of issue in the piecing process, the applique process, or after you're finished and you are quilting it, right? So giving yourself more control, in my opinion, control comes from yardage. You have enough fabric, you can throw it in the washing machine. And I will caveat, fat quarters I do wash in the washing machine. Now I lose a good inch, so I lose some fabric when I do that. And I do also wash fat eighths. It's a bit, they come out pretty hairy. I do wash those. They come out pretty hairy, but I feel like it's worth it. So fat quarters and fat eighths, I will actually throw in the washing machine. I will wash them on delicate, but I will wash them that way just to be sure that, I feel like that's a pretty big piece of fabric and that's big enough that I can wash it. But anything smaller than that, I don't wash. But I do feel generally that washing your fabric, starching, pressing, going from that angle will give you more control. It is going to give you more bang for your buck as far as, being able to expect and have that experience to know what's going on. I would also say that yardage is going to help you develop an idea for the brands and companies that you like. I had this question on buying fabric online just recently on YouTube. And the quilter was saying that a lot of the fabric stores in her area are closing. And then now she's wondering what she should do as far as ordering fabric online. And she used to like to be able to touch it and, know it was good quality fabric and all that kind of stuff. And my advice to her was really simple. It's like, start shopping now and start paying attention to the brands you're buying. So this is something that we might be missing, but it's really important. The selvage, the cardboard insert on the bolt of fabric, it has printing on one end. If you read that, it will say the brand name of the fabric company, and it will say the name of that color. So if you like that brand a lot, you feel like it's a really good quality, then yes, you can absolutely look up that brand and see where it's being sold online. You could even potentially, this is an idea, if you are finishing lots of quilts, you could get a whole bolt of it. So instead of just buying 1 or 2 yards at a time, if you know that you are going to use a mess of white fabric, go on ahead and buy a whole bolt of it, and that way you won't run out tomorrow, right? I think that's a really good idea. I've been doing that since before I became a professional quilter. I was buying bolts of white and black. And then now I typically keep, anywhere from 5 to 10, 15 bolts on the shelf of the colors that I'm using currently, what my favorite colors are right then. And I think that granted, I am doing some volume, right? But even if I wasn't, especially backing fabrics these days, because I'm quilting a lot more, I'm wanting to be able to quickly grab something and not have to piece something together. So that's definitely why I'm choosing those things. Okay, so another reason why you might find that pre-cuts will not serve you forever is because you might start to notice that when you step back from your quilts, they don't have the impact that you're wanting them to have. So this is a fairly good pre-cut pack, but I want you to notice something. There are very few light fabrics. There's like 1 or 2 in the whole pack. 1 or 2 lights. There's like a light pink, there's a yellow and an orange, and then a slightly darker pink. And that's almost it. And there's kind of a beigey green color, but yeah, these are very, very few lights. So your lights are necessary, and this is something that if you ever hear a lecture on color theory, quilter will always say it's not the color that does the work, it's the value. And what that means is when you look at something, you are always looking at it in comparison to the colors around it. So that this dark blue looks really dark. That's a really dark color. I've got a dark purple here, but these are almost the same value. I would say they're really, really close. So if I stuck the 2 of these together and I pieced the 2 of these together side by side in a quilt, you probably would not be able to see them apart unless I put a lighter color in between them. Or that would be really what pops in between the 2 darks, right? So this is something to think about. Fabric manufacturers put these sets together, and they're not necessarily worrying so much about it being a perfect color gradient. They're more worried about it being pretty and being an impulse buy, right? So you're not going to end up with enough lights or enough darks. You're going to mostly end up with a variety of mediums. What are mediums? Mediums are the print that is, it's kind of in between. It's not super light, it's not super dark. When you piece all mediums together, it's like piecing this blue and purple together. You're going to be able to see that those are different colors. You're going to be able to see that those are different prints. But when you step back from it, it's going to be blah. I hope that makes sense. It's not going to be blah in the sense that it's an ugly quilt. It's just going to be blah in the sense that there isn't a dynamic difference in color. You're not having a nice broad spectrum of colors, lights, darks, mediums, and you really want, ideally, more darks and lights, on that further end of the spectrum, and very few mediums in the middle, because that gives you that nice contrast. That gives you that bold separation of color, right? Most pre-cuts are not good at this. Most pre-cut packs mostly include mediums. And for that reason, a lot of your quilts, when you're working with pre-cuts, are going to end up looking value-wise flat. Meaning, like, you're going to step back from it and there's not going to be something that jumps out at you. No overwhelming shape that jumps out at you, because it's all mediums. It's all the same value. So I hope that makes sense. If you're wanting more control over your colors, and maybe choose a darker or lighter background. That's a good way to start putting that in. Maybe pick an accent color. You have your background, but then you also add an additional accent color and make that a light or a dark. So you're adding that in and having a little bit more control over your quilts that way. So that's just an idea. I do think that this was something that I couldn't really wrap my brain around for a good couple of years in quilting. So it took me a while to really be able to go, oh, okay, I kind of get that now. I understand why I want that now. And I don't think it's something that a beginner needs to worry about very much, but certainly if you're, a higher level quilter, if you're wanting to do more with quilting, if you're wanting to compete, then having really good understanding of value and check out those color reducing glasses. I have a pair. They look like red sunglasses, and what they do is they basically take the color out, so all you see is the value. All you see is the whole world in shades of gray, but you see the whole world in shades of gray and the different values they are in relation to one another. So that if you this is how I will set up a gradient. Well, if I have 17 colors and I don't know which one's the lighter one, I'll put on those glasses and suddenly I'll be able to see that's the light one, that's the next one, and I'll be able to put it all in order. Because we get confused by color, it's really easy to see the color rather than the value. So I highly recommend having a pair of those glasses. And then when you're pulling fabrics for a quilt, make sure that you've got your mediums. Let's say you have 7 fabrics for a quilt. If you have 7 fabrics for a quilt, I would aim to have 2 to 3 of those colors be dark, 2 to 3 of those colors be light, and one or maybe 2 be mediums. So you can see kind of and be careful, you might want to mix it up even more than that, it's having a nice variety and being careful not to end up with a whole sea of darks or a whole sea of lights or a whole sea of mediums. You have got to have that contrast in order to really make different elements of the quilt pop. So just off the top of my head, like let's say there's a star in the center of the quilt and you really want that star to just blaze out at you. Well, whatever is behind that star, make that light. So that way if the star is medium or dark, that's going to be elevated. Or vice versa, make the star light and then the background around it dark. It's totally up to you. But if you make both the same value, both medium, it's not going to pop at all. So I hope that makes sense. Okay. No matter how much you like any pre-cut pack, there's always going to be inevitably at least 5 fabrics that you really hate in the pack. I find that every single time. So that is a con. That is a con. You might love it, but you are not going to love every single print inside of it. And no matter what, you can't go to the store and go like, okay, I want this one, but can I switch out 5 of these fabrics for 5 of those fabrics. No, I don't think that they're going to let you do that. So you get what you get. You don't pitch a fit. You're going to end up with fabrics you don't like. So then you got to figure out what you want to do with those extra ones that you're not going to use out of the pre-cut pack. For me, they end up in the trash. You might feel more guilty about that than I do, so you might want to do something else with them. I don't know, maybe you'll have a stash for the uglies or something. But yeah, it doesn't matter what set it is. They always end up being a couple prints that are just kind of not all that pretty, not your favorite, right? So let's see, another thing, speed is not everything. And I might have gotten a little bit misconstrued in some of my last podcast episodes when I was talking about how much time a project takes. I was not aiming to help you guys be speed demons with your projects. If anything, I'd like us to take a little bit more time with our projects just so we can take them through to completion rather than leaving it being an unfinished quilt top, right? I want you to take it all the way through so that you have a finished, meaningful quilt. And that episode, I think that was episode 116, it was really more designed so that if you saw a pattern and you were curious about how long you would be stitching it and working on it, that you would be able to eyeball it. No, I would say any pre-cut where it's all you're working with is pre-cuts and you don't have to trim them down at all, probably in a matter of days you can put that together. But there's a downside to that. You're going to end up with a lot of quilt tops. And unless you're taking the time to quilt all of those quilts, you're going to end up with a big stack of unfinished quilts. And the pre-cut is cheap and easy to buy. It's an impulse buy. The batting and backing fabric, a little bit less so. So I actually have an idea for another podcast episode that's going to be coming up soon. And it's about organizing around finishing and like what it takes to actually get all of these quilt tops. And it's a volume, guys. It is a lot of material goes into finishing these tops. So I would say when you're shopping and you pick up a pre-cut, I want you to go on ahead and price out the batting and the backing fabric to finish it, because that pre-cut represents just a little bit of the quilt top. It's the decorated fabric of the quilt top, and then you've got background fabric to go around it, to put it all together, and then it's not really showing you the actual expense. It's an impulse for that reason. You're not seeing the entire expense coming into play. So go on ahead and think, okay, I'm going to make a baby quilt out of this. So that means I need a crib size batting and I need another yard, maybe 2 yards of fabric to go with that. So go on ahead and buy all of that at once, and then you've got it all. You've got what you need to finish, take the quilt all the way to completion, and then you're also not running away thinking, oh, I've got a quilt right here, because you don't. You only have maybe half of the quilt, maybe a quarter of the quilt, and it's so easy to get stuck, kind of caught in that trap. And I have a whole mess of pre-cut quilt tops to quilt, and I can say, it's really easy to get caught in that. And then now I'm sitting there going like, wow, I'm going to spend a fortune in batting to get all of this stuff quilted. So I'm looking into alternatives like flannel and stuff just to make some really lightweight quilts. Quilts of different weights are really fun, but then it's also just, how much space they take up as well. All of these tops don't take up that much space, but then when I get them quilted and finished, they're going to take up a lot more space then. Right? So it's thinking about all of that stuff and the volume of what we're making. Okay, so getting back to preparing fabric again, I know I've kind of beat it to death, but if, let's say, you take this charm pack and you take it straight out of the package and you piece it together, and you might be assuming that those pieces are 5 inches square. And they're not. First off, this one has pinked edges. So there's a question mark of, do you line up your presser foot with the outside of the zigzag or the inside of the zigzag? I have heard both. I have heard line up your presser foot with the outside of the zigzag, and I've heard line it up with the inside. And I personally don't like the pinking. I would like to cut that off. But if you're in for speed, then obviously you're going to leave it alone and you're just going to sew it together. And then when you go to sew your rows together, if you've not been consistent, let's say on day 1, you sewed and lined up your presser foot with the outer edge of the fabric, with the outer edge of the zigzag of that pinking, and then the next day you forgot and you lined up your presser foot with the inside edge of the pinking, that is an 1/8 of an inch, guys. An 1/8 of an inch off with every single seam. Let's say you've got 20 seams across. That adds up really fast. I mean, that could be inches off, right? So it's not going to be as accurate. It's really not. I was just taking a closer look at this blue, and I can see where, and this is another thing, you really, when you're buying pre-cuts, really investigate, kind of look closely at it. You don't want to take the plastic off. If you take the plastic off, it's yours as far as I'm concerned. But really look closely through that plastic. This one in particular, I can see where the machine, maybe there was like a wrinkle in the fabric and the machine kind of skipped a little bit, and I've got really hairy stuff right through there, and it looks like it skipped a little bit there too. So most likely the strips in this pack are not going to be straight and square to the selvage of the fabric, which means they're going to be doing their own wiggly wobbly dance, and they're already frayed. So you might end up with a bad pre-cut. You might end up with something that's not very well cut. This is another thing to start paying attention to brands. Start paying attention to who does a good job with this and who does quality cutting. And I have just recently run across American Made brand. It's a slightly kind of thicker cotton. It's a little bit on the slubby side, not super, super slubby, but I really like it and had a really accurate pre-cut that I bought. So I really like that. And I like that it was made in America. So as far as I'm concerned, that was, 2 wins in a row. So yeah, I think definitely start paying attention to the brands that you're buying and what is giving you a really good look and you're feeling confident with buying. And then, I mean, occasionally you're going to, I love Kona cotton, but that, is clearly just an odd one out of the batch that just didn't come out very good, right? And that can happen. Everybody has a bad day. But if you start getting consistent, not so great pre-cuts, pay attention to that and maybe start shopping around and seeing if there's other companies that you want to check into or work with. Okay, so this is a really interesting thing. I started thinking about it and I realized, you can make a quilt that is designed for pre-cuts, but making a quilt that is not designed for pre-cuts, out of pre-cuts, is not all that easy. So this was a question I received a whole lot when we were doing the building blocks quilt along. This was back in 2014. And pre-cuts were super popular then too. And I had not planned for pre-cuts to be what I made with building blocks. I was working with yardage. And it was just 2 colors of yardage. And so, I just roughly thought about it and I was like, no, you can't cut with pre-cuts because I had some really big pieces. Like we did some crazy cutting and stuff for the last block. So you needed a 12-inch, I think it was 12-inch square. It might have been bigger. It might have been 13-inch square. So a 13-inch square, there is no pre-cut for that, right? It wouldn't have worked to piece stuff together and then cut it apart. It was just a weird block. So that was one situation where I got kind of caught by that, and I can remember thinking, okay, so something can be made for pre-cuts, but unless you go into it designing that way, it's really hard to reverse something and make it for pre-cuts after the fact. I hope that makes sense. Basically, if you have a pre-cut and you want a pattern for it, you should be searching for patterns for that pre-cut specifically, not just a general pattern, because that general pattern is probably going to be written assuming that you are cutting from yardage. So that is my general assumption whenever I am writing a pattern, I am writing to yardage. So I'm thinking, okay, let's start with our biggest pieces first, cut those selvage to selvage, so if, let's say I have like a 12-inch square or something being cut, then that's going to be the first thing that you cut. That's the first thing that's on the list. And, automatically that takes out pre-cuts. You can't cut that pattern if it requires something that isn't a pre-cut, right? So think about that. That's going to limit you in the quilts that you're making. If you're only buying precuts, if you're only sewing and quilting with precuts, you're not going to be able to make the amazing variety of quilts that you can make, right? You're not going to be able to make certain ones. And I think that that's okay in the beginning, but if you start getting bored, boredom is always the thing to be paying attention to. If you start to feel like, yeah, this is just kind of dull. I'm not really being, challenged. I'm not really feeling enthusiastic about quilting. If you're starting to feel that doldrums kind of feeling, then that's something to pay attention to. And I think that's certainly a situation where you want to start pushing yourself and start challenging yourself to try new things. I'm doing English paper piecing as I sit here and chat with you guys. And English paper piecing is a totally different form of piecing. You could absolutely use pre-cuts for English paper piecing. You could use any type of fabric for English paper piecing. I'm right now working with clothing. This is material from my husband's grandmother-in-law. My grandmother-in-law's clothing. So you have a much wider range of things that you can work with if you broaden your horizon and start playing with other things. So if you feel bored, pay attention to that. Watch out for that. Don't stay bored. Don't stay frustrated. It's hard when you get in a rut like that. It is very hard to bust out of it because, of course, it's going to take you time to learn something new. It's going to take time to learn how to prep that yardage properly and, build that skill set, build that skill in your hands and skill in your fingers. I've been talking to James about that a lot. He's been making cookies a lot, which is not all that great for me, but he loves it. He loves to bake. But, he bakes, and every time he makes a mess in the kitchen. And I'm like, James, you're 12 years old. You are old enough to be able to bake and keep the space clean. It's two skill sets here. It's the one skill set is being able to control your hands, control the batter, control everything that's going into the pot, or going into the bowl. And then the other skill set is following the instructions on the recipe, right? So the same thing for quilting. When you are changing things up and trying something new, you're building new skill in your hands, new skill in your brain, and you're probably going to make a mess or two. It's probably not going to feel as easy as it did before, but that's the challenge. That's where it's at, basically. And one more thing to think about for piecing with pre-cuts exclusively, and that is the danger of miscutting. So let's say you were piecing something with this, and I think I might have gotten this years ago. Let's say that this is a 5-year-old pre-cut. Most likely those fabrics are not still available. Solids, you're probably going to be able to find another one of those. Solid reading something, that the brand is still around, that those fabrics are still available. You're most likely going to be able to find that. But a charm square, a 5-inch square pack, one of the fabrics within it, you have no idea what the name is because the selvage is not on it. You might be able to figure out from they put the little codes, the little numbers on the back, but 5 years later, are you going to be able to cross-reference and find that online and then to be able to buy the amount that you need? If you miscut on something like this, the easiest thing is just to go to your stash and find something similar enough and just not make it a big deal. But I know, and I have heard from a lot of quilters over the years, that is a point that can get them stuck, that can just ruin a project, where that miscut happens, a mistake happens, they can't get more fabric, and then that indecision of where to go, what to do next, how to fix it, it creates a roadblock. It really does. It creates a definitive roadblock that stops that project in its tracks. So that is another danger of pre-cuts. And I think that the best way to approach that, if that happens to you or has happened to you in the past, is just, and this would be a good thing, I think, to kind of talk to yourself about, is just say, I had in mind what I was going to do, and I made a mistake, and that whole idea is now dead. It cannot work. And then now I'm going to give this project new life by going in this direction, and I'm giving myself permission to make a new project. And it's then saying, okay, I'm going to go pull from my stash that something similar to that color of blue. Or I'm going to go pull from my stash a bright orange because you know what? I want to just glam this up. I want to add a little bit of pizzazz to my mistake, and that's okay, guys. I think that when we get stuck, a lot of that stuck is regret and guilt. And we got to let that junk go because it's not necessary and it's not good. And buying 2 pre-cuts, I feel like that, especially if you don't need that much, I feel like that's a little excessive. I don't feel like you need to go that far to try and guarantee you're not going to have a mistake that can't be fixed, right? Especially if you only need that one little square of fabric, just find something else that will work. It's not the end of the world. Overall, I have loved pre-cuts. Especially, I like the solids. I think the solids are really useful. I will probably still end up using this, even though it's got a little bit of a fray kind of thing going on, but I'll probably take this and use it. I might use this for binding. I would cut it down. I bind typically at 2 inches wide rather than 2.5. So yeah, I can definitely find ways of using this up and making this into a quilt. The reason why I've kind of gotten out of pre-cuts is because of the value, because everything ends up being a medium and all kind of blurring together. And then too, like the prints are very busy. And for me, my emphasis is on the quilting. I want my quilting to show. I want it to stand out. I want that to be visible and pretty on the surface, right? So that doesn't really work. To have a super, super busy print where I can't see what I'm doing and you're not going to be able to see that pretty quilting design I've just bothered to stitch with rulers or whatever, So I feel like that's a limitation. That's why I say, I like the solids. I will use the solid pre-cuts, absolutely. But I'm leaning more and more away from the really busy printed pre-cuts, those packs and stuff. Those just don't work for me as well anymore. When I'm in a hurry and I know, like, let's say I have a gift quilt to make for someone and I know their style and I know, what's going to fit for them really, really well, then I will absolutely grab a pre-cut if I think that that's going to be a good fit. Or, seasonal pre-cuts are like my killer. I will always succumb to a seasonal pre-cut, like a Christmas pre-cut or a Halloween pre-cut. And then it ends up setting in my drawer and I don't end up making anything out of it. So those are the various reasons why I'm kind of leaning away from that. I like the simplicity. I like being able to make a quilt in a day if that's something I'm needing to do, but I have not necessarily enjoyed having 50 plus quilt tops needing to be quilted, and the amount of expense and time it's going to take to get all of those done. So I would say, if you're enjoying pre-cuts, keep enjoying your pre-cuts. Absolutely. Keep doing what you love. That is the whole point. Now, if you are getting bored, that is a bad sign. So definitely pay attention to that and start challenging yourself to move away from pre-cuts and into yardage so you can do more with it. You can make bigger blocks. You can really just experiment and explore a different avenue of quilting, because there's some things that you can't do with pre-cuts. You can't work with big giant pieces with pre-cuts because, the biggest piece is a 10-inch square, right? So if you're feeling bored, I think you need to get away from that for a little while, challenge yourself to try new things. And if you're interested in learning more about cutting and piecing from yardage and making very precise quilts, I have written a book on this, and it is Stitch It Up a Notch, How to Piece Perfect Quilts, and it covers all of the basics from cutting, piecing, and then we have lots of really excellent beginner tutorials and quilts that you can create too. So if that is something that is interesting you, I think that book is going to definitely give you some help understanding the different nuances of fabric, because there's so much more to it than just unrolling something and getting started. This is a great way to get started, but if you want to go further with it, I really think yardage is the way to go. It does take more time, but the point is to take the time that we need to make the quilt that we really want to create. Not just the cookie quilt, the super quick thing, but the quilt that we really want to create that best represents our highest contribution, our highest level of achievement. And we want to be challenged by that. We do this, like I said, I've said this many times in the last couple of months. We do this because it's hard, right? Not because it's easy and not because it's quick. We cut up fabric and sew it all back together again for that reason. So think about that. And if you're not feeling challenged, start thinking about those. You've probably been getting a little nudge from the universe as to what you need to make next. So start following that nudge and see where it leads.